You're listening to Jay's Analysis, integrating film, philosophy, geopolitics, literature, history, economics, intrigue, and espionage, only at JaysAnalysis.com. And now, Jay's Analysis Podcast, with your host, Jay Dyer. You're listening to Jay's Analysis. Back for part 3 of our cult series is author, researcher James Kelley. James is the author of Anatomizing Divinity, a study in the history of Western Hermeticism in relation to the history of ideas in Western theology and religion. James is also a researcher who has spent a lot of time focusing on philosophy of science, and he's no stranger to Jay's Analysis. We've had many excellent talks, and hopefully we will have many future talks. James, how are you?
Great. How are you doing, Jay?
I'm doing well. Before we get going, I should also plug MichiganMushrooms.net. They are the sponsor for this broadcast, this podcast. MichiganMushrooms.net offers a variety of chaga mushrooms. They are excellent to put in teas and in coffees. And if you would like to help Jay's Analysis, please go over to MichiganMushrooms.net and you can get their organic, fresh, harvested. They actually harvest their own mushrooms. Husband and wife team, they go out in the woods and they find the best mushrooms that you can get. So check them out. They do deliver. There is free delivery at this point. So MichiganMushrooms.net. And as listeners know, you are my aid and my support. So if you like this, please subscribe to Jay's Analysis. It's $4.95 a month, and you get great interviews like this, and you also get my philosophy lectures as I cover topics such as Plato, geopolitics, and interviews as substantial and high quality as James L. Kelley. So we're going to talk Scientology today. James, I guess the best place to start is, let's start on a light note. There was a movie that recently came out by Paul Thomas Anderson, and it was called The Master. And I actually got to see it, thankfully, in full 35 millimeter, the way it was supposed to be seen. So it wasn't in a digital format. It was actually in the classic film format. And I saw it at an independent theater. It was an enjoyable experience, a great film. What did you think of that film, first of all, before we delve into Hubbard and Crowley?
Well, I thought it was interesting that Anderson, you know, he deals with, obviously, he said himself it's inspired by L. Ron Hubbard, the main character. I forget his name, but it's a very regal sounding name, the character that's based on Hubbard in the film. Played by
Philip Seymour Hoffman.
Brant. Right. Brant from The Big Lebowski. No, I'm just kidding. That's another role.
It is, right. That is
Hoffman played.
Right, yeah.
I just know him as Brant, you know. But I found it interesting that what Anderson seemed to be trying to do in the film is not say Hubbard is good, Hubbard is bad, but I think he was trying to show that, you know, Hubbard attracted people for a lot of reasons, and he brought out some things that other people were able to go further in their lives with, at least in their own perceptions, so that you have the Joaquin Phoenix actor portrays a character who basically, as you told me one time, he's looking for a father figure. He's looking for something.
Yeah, a drifter without a father figure. Right?
He is a drifter, and then when he starts into the quote-unquote auditing session with the Hubbard figure, he has this obvious desire to please. No, I can concentrate on these questions, and I can. But I think he also has a deep-seated wish to unravel something inside of himself that he doesn't know how to get to. You know, the Phoenix character is very dissatisfied with the Norman Rockwell photographs that he's taking. He takes a photograph of the staid, middle-aged businessman who's obviously succeeded, quote-unquote, in the 40s and 50s style America. And he's disgusted with that, and he realizes that that's not what he even wants. So what kind of game is he going to play if he doesn't want to succeed, or he's not happy with those who succeed? So then he ends up meeting the Hubbard character, and I think what Anderson really showed, which could probably not be said but had to be showed cinematically, is that people that get into Scientology, I think a lot of times they're trying to find something that's within their own minds or within their own experience, and it's a vehicle for doing that. So a person feels like, hey, I brought all this to the table, and they're just helping me unfold what I already have. Mm-hmm. So I don't think Anderson is saying become a Scientologist or don't become one. There's plenty of satire against Hubbard in it, but I think in the final analysis, I think that what Anderson, not that there's an argument in film per se, it's aesthetic, but I think one thing you can take away from it is that I think a lot of times we dismiss Hubbard as just this rube, just this absolute heel. I mean, he had absolutely no redeeming grace whatsoever, and he's just been an absolute negative influence on everyone that he ever came into contact with. But I think that there was a certain playfulness and a certain it's hard to put it into words, but it's an ability to get out of the ruts of life. Mm-hmm. That I think he had to fall back on in his own life, Hubbard the real man, and I think other people were able to use some of his techniques to get out of some probably life-threatening depressions and weird hang-ups that people get into. Now, as far as Hubbard being, offering salvation, no way. Obviously, I don't believe that. And probably very few people outside of the Church of Scientology believe
you strike me as more of a Heaven's Gate kind of guy than a Hubbard kind of guy. So,
well, I don't know. Here's why I would count.
What's your favorite cult? Collect all 5.
You know what? Scientology is getting up there. Although I hate to say that, because whenever, here's the underlying thing. Whenever a person who's committed to a religious group like I am, Eastern Orthodox Christianity, when you start discussing other religions, you feel a pressure to be the anti-cult person, and I think you can react against that too much and just say, well, I'm kind of a believer in perennial wisdom, and Hubbard, puts forward some perennial truths. Well, I'm neither of those. I'm just a person that wants to understand why thousands of very intelligent people, spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on this. Are they all stupid? Are they all, lower than me or lower than you, and so they're duped into it? So how does this all work? And I think that's a step beyond the polemics, which, let's face it, I mean, there's a lot to polemicize about with Hubbard, definitely true. But I think there has to be, if we're going to get past this Scientology thing, or at least engage with it or whatever, we have to give the very best version of the opponent, or else it's a fruitless endeavor. Don't you agree?
Yeah, that's what we do in philosophy, is understand, ultimately, we hope, the position of an opponent better even than the opponent. That would be the goal that we shoot for.
Exactly. And here's one thing. You said other cults. I think that what Hubbard has that Heaven's Gate doesn't have is Heaven's Gate does not have, in my opinion, a very detailed doctrine. You can't go, hey, let me look up Lecture 46 of the Philadelphia Doctorate course, as you can with Hubbard, and find very detailed descriptions of everything that Hubbard believes in, from a variety of angles, told in a very conversational way, which leads you up to more abstract and difficult to understand concepts. You don't really get that with Heaven's Gate. As far as I know, there's kind of just an occasional newsletter and odd little addresses by Doe or Applewhite. I think there's more to sink your teeth into. It's kind of like saying, okay, well, the pre-Socratic philosophers, there's not much there to go by. Yes, it's very rich what you get, the fragments, but if you go to the German Romantics, they've got 200 and 300 page treatises that you can go point by point and try to get into the texture of what leads them from one point to the other. Hubbard does that, but if you read what most people write about Scientology, they pretend like that there's not this richness and that there's not this detail. It's just there's Xenu and the reactive mind, and that's all that most people really get into. Even Reitman and her Inside Scientology. Very light on actual explication of the teachings. So I would be more of a Scientology guy in that regard than Heaven's Gate. Even saying that is so wrong for me. You know that, but it's kind of funny to do that.
It would be funny to kind of, I'm just joking here, but some people take this approach of perennial philosophy where they want to experience every different religion. I was just thinking how screwed up you'd be if you took a perennial approach to the cults. Like you would just completely be brainwashed and mind blown. But let's get into this. So we've had the icebreaker here with Paul Thomas Anderson's excellent film, and we got an inkling of his interpretation of what I took to be, and I did do an analysis of the Master, just from sort of a psychological standpoint, which I think that's what he was going with in that film. It wasn't really dealing with esoteric concepts. It wasn't dealing with any of the deeper, darker aspects of this cult, but it was dealing with the psychology. How do people get involved in this? Why do they get involved in this? What is motivating the kind of cult leader like L. Ron Hubbard? And not just, like you said, a negative appraisal, but actually looking at the factors in a person's life that bring him to a position where he wants to be the father figure cult leader, and the people who are abused in this system that want the father figure. So let's talk first then about, what's the best place to start? Do we want to talk about Hubbard himself, or do you want to get into the actual doctrines and theology, so-called, of Scientology?
Maybe the actual doctrines and theology. The way I sort of envisioned, how could I present this same information? I say same information because, as previously stated, not many people get into the, thousands of lecture-length, presentations that he gave. I think a lot of people are just like, well, I just need to read Dianetics and, a few of the other later books, and then I'm good. But there's a lot more than that. So that's a long-winded way of saying, I think what I can do is go right into the doctrines and kind of arrange it like Fichte, or try to arrange his science of learning, or science of knowledge.
Well, let me ask you the question this way then. Let's start with the term. So Scientology. So we get the impression that this has the air or the veneer of science involved in it.
Sure.
So is it a scientistic cult? Is it a kind of Blavatsky style, Mary Eddy Baker style? Is this where we're going?
In a sense it is, but let me just say a word on the epistemology that he's dealing with. It's interesting. I think for Hubbard, and we'll get into the details of this later, I'll just lay it out pretty basically. Hubbard sort of actually takes on in my opinion, a point of view towards epistemology, which is how we know what we know. And Scientology is the science of how to know, or the science of knowing, is what it literally means, the science of logos, the body of knowledge of the ultimate knowledge. But he takes on a point of view towards knowing and how we know that is really lines up really well, I think, with the Western metaphysical tradition. And here's what I mean by that. For Hubbard, the lowest form of knowledge would be skepticism. The lowest form of knowledge would correspond to two states that are sort of weird poles. One would be a plurality of spiritual beings, or Thetans, which have never postulated any games or are not doing anything but sitting still. To him, that would be skepticism, because no one is postulating anything. Nothing's happening. The other side of that lowest form of knowledge would be Thetans who are completely trapped in matter, to the point that they don't believe that there is a game and don't care about a game anymore. So that's the lowest form of knowing.
Now, I am familiar with the Thetans and the doctrine of becoming clear from all this, but could you elaborate on what you mean by positing games? I'm confused.
Sure. Basically, here's how Hubbard puts it. He says, there isn't anything that's absolutely true or false. There are only games.
Oh, okay.
And what are games? Well,
maybe like a Wittgensteinian sense of language games, and
it's more like, in a way, but it's more like in Western philosophy, the different strands of it, particularly Platonic metaphysics and its later manifestations, where you have the idea that, well, we're starting with, something that's absolutely unmixed and absolutely pure. Now, for Plotinus and others, it's like we're starting with the one. So how do we get to an individual who's perceiving entities out here in a field of perception? So there's that. Your doctrine builds up everything in between that. Well, for Hubbard, likewise, he's saying, okay, what's the ultimate entity? Well, it's not the material body. It's got to be a spiritual entity, which he calls a Thetan. And the realm of spirit in general is Theta. And so basically what he says is, where we start is we start with a plurality of Thetans, spiritual beings.
Yes.
And if not, and the only way that anything can change, or there can be anything that actually happens, is if more than one Thetan decides to postulate, or how would you say that other than postulate? You make a decision that there is a reality. It's a mutual decision between two Thetans that, there's going to be a thing called space. And there are going to be these laws that are going to be operative in space. They could be anything. You could go into the Leibniz route and say, well, everything has to become possible. You can't say up is down and down is up at the same time. So there are those kinds of, impossibilities. But nonetheless, for the Thetans, they decide, well, here's what's going to be below us. And it's a mutual thing. I'm communicating to you that this lower realm of space, time, energy, mass exists, and you're agreeing with me on that. So in that sense, things become more differentiated. More subsidiary entities and processes and happenings can take place now. And so presumably more Thetans can add their input, and things become more and more. Now here's the trick, though. There's two, how does evil come into the world? And how does anything get screwed up so that there's a problem Scientology has to solve? Well, there's a couple of ways that this happens, according to Hubbard. One is for the Thetans to agree on a postulate of a lower realm, then they have to, in a sense, forget that they know that it's a postulate on some level. If they didn't, then there really wouldn't be a postulate to him. You would just be saying, well, there's really no postulate because I don't want to make the postulate. If you make the postulate, then there's the risk, and even it shades over into the possibility and then the reality that the Thetans themselves have forgotten that they postulated the rules and the reality of the game in the first place. So then they're trapped in the game to some degree. Now, that's one scenario that he puts out there in his lectures. Another scenario is kind of, I call it like the Luciferian scenario. It's where there's a trickster Thetan. He doesn't use that term. I'm just describing.
Yeah, right.
The trickster Thetan says, what would be funny is that if I postulated something that they didn't agree to right in the middle of their game, and they're liable to think that, well, maybe that's just one other thing that we forgot along with the other rule-oriented postulates that we have. So this trickster Thetan says, okay, I'm going to postulate that you can start a process of postulation, but it gets harder to control it, and it's almost impossible to end it. And to Hubbard, that's what he calls incident one. Incident one is where almost every Thetan, if not all Thetans, are fooled into thinking that they have trouble stopping the processes and games that they start. So it just leads you moving on dialectically without understanding that you can stop the game. And so incident one has to be cured by Scientology, or else you can't reach that highest level where you postulated the game. So that's incident one. And I think understanding that helps us understand the infamous incident two, which is Xenu. If we understand incident one, then we can understand that incident two, which supposedly happened between 74 and 75 million years ago, we can understand that that's just a specific, historical quote-unquote version of incident one. In incident two, we have the name of the guy that actually is the trickster Thetan, which is Xenu.
So hold on a second. But to make this a little bit clearer, perhaps, for listeners that might be a little confused at this point. Would this be comparable to, say, a situation where we might have an obscure, abstruse metaphysic where it's somewhat similar to polytheism or animism, maybe something along the lines of the Hermetica, where the original unity is then produces some sort of multiplicity based on what you're calling the Thetans here, that for all levels of reality, they sort of produce this through cooperation on the part of what we call sentient beings here on this planet. Is that what you're getting at? So in other words, time and space and all the relations that we know about, that this is similar to the way that the Hermetica, for example, speaks of the gods as sort of being related to these overarching principles like time, space, nature. Is that what you're saying?
Definitely related to that, but one difference I would say between the Hubbardian cosmology and then that of the Hermetica and Gnosticism and so on and so forth is that there is no one. You know, there's the realm of theta, but we're starting with a plurality.
So we start with multiplicity.
And guess what? We're Thetans. Now, here's one thing, just as a sidebar to throw in there, is that he got into postulating lower entities, which are sentient beings, which he called GEs. I think they're general entities, but I could be wrong about what it stands for. There's about 1 million terms to learn.
Yeah, right, there are. And he also posits these different kingdoms, as I understand. Is this where this is going to come into play?
Yeah, he says that there are something like over a dozen races of Thetans, and then there are a couple of races of GEs. And the Thetans are higher beings than the GEs. So he also says in one of his lectures that one sort of sin, if you will, or is to leave your own race and breed with, to reproduce with a member of another race. So we find this in Blavatsky, in whatever it is, the Rudolf Steiner's viewpoint or his thought.
But we also find with Blavatsky that attempt to give it the veneer of science.
Exactly. Yes. And it does have, for Hubbard, that's why I started off with the epistemological thing. Mm-hmm. For him, we already covered the lowest level of thought. For him, higher than skepticism would be just divine fiat. We do this because there's a higher power that says we should do it. Good and evil doesn't enter into it. Mm-hmm. A higher sort of point of view than that would be kind of an engineering point of view, where it's like, well, there are these laws that we can see out in nature. And if we're going to build our society and build our ethics on these laws because they work, that would be a higher morality or a higher, more Thetan-oriented existence. But even higher than that would be the ultimate cleared operating Thetan level, where you're like, what happens is that the laws, so-called laws of nature, were just originally postulates of Thetans. So we can't give them this ultimate, scientific seal of approval. It's how things work now, but we can make it work any way we want.
Yeah, okay.
So in a sense, it's scientific. In a sense, it's not.
So there's also this openness theology, this process theology or philosophy that allows for potentiality to go in any direction.
Absolutely. And with the Xenu thing, we should probably just launch into Xenu a little bit, because
sure.
Incident 2, I mean, it gets raked over the coals. How could anyone believe in this? It's, Hubbard uses the term space opera to describe the Xenu myth, the Xenu Incident 2. But the whole idea, if you think about it, people criticize the Xenu myth because they say, well, we know that glycol and alcohol is not going to freeze anything together and all of that. But I think we should understand this is almost 75 million years ago. We have no idea what kind of laws of nature were in effect then. And if you're going to just look at things from Hubbard's perspective, the Thetans could have postulated and forgot about totally different rules of reality at that time. And when he may be using the terms glycol and alcohol to liken what those substances were to what we would think now. So I'm not going so far as to say the Xenu myth is allegory, because Hubbard says it is not allegory. It is word for word, absolute revelation. So I have to respect that. But I will say it's kind of like saying there was a tree in the Garden of Eden. Is it a sycamore tree? I mean, even in our own religious tradition, you know, you have people that are like, well, the world is 6,000 years old, and then you have other people that can be perfectly Christian and say, well, you know, this is poetry describing the way things happen, you know, that kind of a thing. And so I think with Hubbard in the Xenu myth, I think that it's not as ridiculous as people want to make it out to be. I mean, if we look at the Apocryphon of John or any of these Gnostic texts, for some reason, because of our cultural prejudices, we would say, oh, this is real stuff. Even though I disagree with it, this is rich, you know. But we wouldn't say that about Hubbard because we tend to think, well, this comes from science fiction books, you know. But I think we have to get past that and realize that the way that Hubbard appealed to people was that he mixed together Fichte and all of this stuff in a way with sort of dime store novels, and said, you know, that part of you that likes to read dime store novels, I know I like to read them. That same part of you, there's no other compartment that houses, you know, the highest principles of philosophy and wisdom. There's a continuity between those two poles, and here it is. And I'll present it to you in this very charismatic, you know, presentation, you know.
So okay, so let's get into Xenu. Tell us more about Xenu and how this fits into the cosmology of Hubbard.
Sure. Basically, the whole idea of Xenu is that this Earth, which back then was called Tegeac, Hubbard says, was part of a planetary confederation which has all these planets and stars in it at that time period. And that ultimately what happened is that there were these loyal officers who were the protectors of the people. They were democratically elected officers. And they elected a man or a being named Xenu, or Xenu, whichever you prefer. He said both.
Real quick before we get into that, what is Hubbard's medium by which he claims to know this? Just revelation or what?
Well, basically what Hubbard did is he said that he studied all the spiritual techniques and ideas of all peoples, even Tibetan. He went to Tibet supposedly, which we don't think he really did, but he supposedly studied the wisdom of all ages and ultimately realized in an out-of-body experience.
Okay, so out-of-body experience, okay.
He had an out-of-body experience where he realized that you could boil down everything to one single concept or word, which is survive. And so he said ultimately there are these concentric rings of different dynamics, he called them, such as personal survival, group survival, you know, civilizational survival. It goes all the way up to the eighth dynamic, which is the supreme being.
Okay.
And he said basically for this to survive and thrive and so forth, that there are certain techniques that you can enact, and it has to do at that point. See, we're talking early Dianetics when he first started talking about these things. His whole focus at that point was that there are these insistments of confusion between the theta or spiritual reality and matter, energy, space, time, or mess. We have these little poles or insistments inside of our being that have to be smoothed out and done away with so that we can evolve further, and so that we're not just simply stimulus response beings, which what he claimed is what happens is we have this holdover, this evolutionary holdover from when we were apes or lower beings, and that this is the reactive mind. And what happens is we'll see a red flag or we'll hear a sound, and it will reactivate an experience where our reactive mind took over and said, okay, rational mind, you're done for the moment, because right now this emergency is such a high level that we're taking over and we're going to make you fall down, or we're going to make you jump back because this is too dangerous. And so what Hubbard claims is that, well, this reactive mind was evolutionarily necessary, but right now we have to kind of get rid of that baggage, and we have to move on to the next level, which is the analytical mind, which is where you're kind of a computing system which says, okay, here's an image, here's something that happens to me, and I'm going to compute that this is the most logical and survival-oriented reaction based on the laws of nature. We'll see. So what's the difference between that and Xenu and the later stuff? Well, in the later stuff, he's like, okay, so we've got the analytical mind turned on. we're dialing it in and we're doing everything that's optimally survival oriented. And he's like, well, okay, that's all good and fine, but at this point, there's a whole realm above that, which is where you realize you're a Thetan and you can postulate the rules. So it's not just about following these survival rules, it's about being able to destroy the rules that exist and make your own universe, make your own rules, and not be controlled by the postulates that you just simply forgot somewhere along the way.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of how it all fits together, kind of diachronically, in terms of his teaching.
Okay, so that's how he receives this message. Now, take us back to Xenu and his place in this as trickster.
Okay, so Xenu, the elected supreme ruler, is exactly how Hubbard describes him.
Is he a rap god like Kanye?
No,
The supreme ruler, the rap god.
Yeah, I think when Hubbard goes into that ruler kind of, I think he's trying to sound like grandiloquent and vaguely English and regal, to kind of communicate to his audience that now we're talking about big time stuff, but he also wants them to laugh and be loose and to keep listening. So that's kind of his rhetorical strategy. But hey, I mean, kind
of like Joseph Smith writing the Book of Mormon in King's English.
Absolutely. Yes, he lapses into that. And so what Xenu does, the elected supreme ruler, is he begins to actually start to suppress the people that he's kind of the monarch or the elected ruler over. And the reason why he does this is Xenu says, well, all these planets are all so overpopulated that no one's going to be able to survive. It's not going to work. So what Xenu did is he cooked up this scheme with these other renegade administrators, this cabal of conspirators who said, look, we're going to go beyond this loyal guard that elected me, and they're about to kick me out of office. So before I do that, I'm going to just do this cosmic coup where I'm going to kidnap and implant a postulate into the minds of all the people in the world. And what it's going to do is it's going to immobilize them so they're not going to be running around eating and making things hard on everyone else. So it's going to solve the overpopulation problem. And just in general, it's going to cause people not to survive. Most people aren't going to survive and thrive. So to Xenu, this is what he does. So what he does is he takes all the people and he imprisons them somehow so that their body and their spiritual being, their Thetans, are captured. And they're flown to Earth, which is called Tigiak, supposedly back then. And then they're put beside volcanoes and their hydrogen bombs are set off to basically capture them in a form where they can never get out. Mm-hmm. And at this time, though, Incident 2 occurs. In Incident 2, there's a kind of film strip, a kind of cinema show called R6, is what Hubbard calls it. And this is very important for understanding Hubbard's theology. Xenu realized that in order to make people not survive, and even if they have kids, make them not survive, and just make them, basically give them this imprisoned form of mind where they can never get back to being Thetans, they can never get back to the overpopulation problem, is he implanted this thing called R6. And what R6 is, this is interesting, and I want to know what you think about this. It's an image, a film strip, a vivid film strip in the heads of all these captured Thetans, which shows every human being rolled into one, all being crucified. And not only are they being crucified, but there are surgeons. There's psychologists and surgeons that are also working on this sort of composite man where every human being is rolled into one. You've got the psychiatrist is shocking the crucified man, and the surgeon is slowly ripping off all the flesh of the crucified man, revealing the innards. And then, when it gets down to the skeletonized crucified being who's still screaming and still in excruciating pain, then the bones are carved up. The bones are cut up. So this is what Hubbard says is implanted in. And he says later on, people felt this kind of emotionalism because they saw themselves as the crucified man, so they created Christianity out of that. And he said, basically, here's what... let me just read this paragraph out of my notes.
Sure.
I said, basically, the R6 is a concretized film. It concretizes the idea that you start a process, but you can't stop it. So Xenu starts the process of, hey, I'm a crucified being. I failed to survive. And I say here, R6's primary implant is an image of every Thetan as a crucified human being. In other words, being imprisoned in a no-game condition, nailed to one place, in a ritual that peels back the flesh to bone and then cuts into the bones. The surgeons who cut and the psychiatrists who shock are those who show that pain is the ultimate reality. And the further you go into the matter of the body, there is yet more pain. And it goes on throughout all eternity, and I put in parentheses, hell. And Hubbard specifically says this is where the idea of the devil and hell comes from, is you're going to see an image of yourself, which you've forgotten, which is of you failing to survive throughout eternity and feeling nothing but pain. And for Hubbard, pain was what the reactive mind forces on you when you can't survive an emergency situation. So that's kind of his comparative religion.
So that's where he sticks Christianity in this overall narrative. Okay.
Sure.
Interesting. So then that's the background. How do we get to where we are now with the bombers and the volcanoes?
Well, basically, as I think you and I discussed this one time, but I think ultimately Hubbard got a lot of mileage out of this idea that, well, Xenu, back in Xenu's day, almost 75 million years ago, they flew planes that looked just like ours, DC-28s or what were used to. And he said in these DC-28s, he said the only difference, the reason why they could go from the star Polaris all the way to Earth almost instantly is because he said Einstein was wrong and you can go faster than the speed of light. And if you understand the whole thing of Thetans and postulates, you realize that all you'd have to do if you were a higher operating Thetan is just say, no, that rule doesn't work anymore. I can go here now.
Ad hoc divine fiat, just declare a new rule.
Declare a new rule because you can control the rules. So yeah, he would say that, if you walked on the streets of these planets that surrounded Polaris, you would see streets that look just like America circa 1950. So we're looking at, it's a world that Humphrey Bogart, would really, he would find himself at home probably. And also the cars, boats, trains, planes, everything is the same. He said, basically now, and he said the reason why it looks the same as that now is because we're still imprisoned by this R6 implant. So we keep on producing what he says. Look, he says the man on the cross, he said if you translate that into cultural civilizational terms, you get Western civilization. He says, which is a fail. He said, we call it progress, but he said what it is just a dynamic crucifixion of everyone involved in it. And I find that interesting as somebody who, I like to study these decline of the West type narratives, Spengler, Toynbee, the so-called universalist historians. And I don't believe everything they say, but I just find it breathtaking how people say, well, here's the answer to the whole thing. It's kind of the opposite of that historiography you mentioned where it's like one damn thing after the other. It's like, no, there's a plan. And there's a big danger to that, but this is one of the more interesting ones I've heard of, Hubbard's view.
Yeah, the Maltese freakazoid. That's what would Bogey be searching for in that case, if he's on this other planet looking for a falcon with something implanted inside of it.
He'd be wanting to get rid of the R6 implant, probably. I don't know how you turn that into movies. However, Hubbard himself, wrote many. He was a science fiction author originally.
Well, that's what I'd like to discuss next. So we've got this elaborate mythology and philosophy here that he received, I guess, out of divine revelation, out-of-body experience, whatever, however he conceives of it. Now, come on now. Let's get real and let's get pragmatic here. This guy's writing a bunch of sci-fi,
sure,
dime store type stuff that, as you mentioned. When this was getting going, did people not just immediately call this out? Was there not an uproar of, oh, come on, dude, you're the guy who's, you're obviously writing science fiction here?
Yeah, I mean, there were people who, here's the thing to understand about Incident 2 and the Xenu myth. Everyone's probably knows something about this, but it's only in the last, I think, maybe 20 years on the internet that anyone that hadn't spent, $40,000 to $80,000 was privy to that Incident 2 information. You had
right,
to,
and that's because the documents were. Is this the Fishman papers with OTA, and then the Church of Scientology denies that the Fishman papers are legitimate.
Sure, they usually try to.
Yeah.
They usually just try to say we can't talk about that.
Right.
So they're not denying it. I don't see how they would be able to deny it since they believe that every word that Hubbard said is doctrine. But then again, they're caught in a dilemma. So, people will, when you've got two things that you have to uphold and they can contradict each other, it gets hard to be consistent. So, they're inconsistent.
The mentions of Christianity are pertinent because I've read a good bit on UFO cults, and I was just reading a book before we did this interview on that very subject, and there is a section on Hubbard and Scientology and that work. And one of the good points that this author made in his treatment was that you'll notice a lot of the UFO cults, a lot of the exotheology, they will borrow a lot of biblical terminology and symbolism and imagery. And that's because this has a good selling point for people in the West, because everybody's generally familiar with some aspect of Christianity, because that's still, relatively speaking, the predominant religion. So you see this trend where they co-opt, a lot of the biblical terminology and ideas of redemption or imagery of the cross. And, Scientology even uses the cross in their symbolism. So I'm glad that you gave that treatment there of where Hubbard wants to place Christianity in his overall mythos. I keep thinking Xenu here.
It is mythos, though.
It is. I keep thinking of Xena the Warrior Princess, that crappy TV show that was on USA Network or something. So, but real quick question before we get into the next phase of this. Now, is there anything else you want to lay out before I ask another question and shift? Is there anything else you want to bring out about the
two things about the Christian symbolism or the
go ahead.
overlap? Yes, I think that the use of the cross. Keep in mind, on some of the earliest, Hugh Urban goes into this in an article he writes about the supposed, the cult. I think the article is called "The Occult Origins of Scientology," and he talks about Hubbard's interest in thelema, the Aleister Crowley's religious sexual magic cult. And he was interested in that, and that's where he may have gotten the idea of the Thetan. The letter theta is spoken of by Aleister Crowley as being this primary symbol for the linking of the linga and the yoni, and ultimately Hubbard interpreted that as, well, the evolutionary chain moving forward. In order for it's kind of an analogy to the agreed-on postulate by the two Thetans.
Yeah, I had a whole list of all the Crowley sex magic stuff that I wanted to get to with the background. So, do you want to transition into that?
Sure. I mean, okay. Here's the basic fact of it is that, and I think it was 1946 thereabouts.
It's 46, right?
Yeah, 46. Hubbard came back from the war, a very sort of inglorious career in the war. He came back to Pasadena, California, and he met John Whiteside Parsons. For those who do not know, George Pendle wrote a great book called Strange Angel. Mm-hmm. But to me, it was a boring book, but it was a good book because what you really want to know is, wow, he did sex magic with Hubbard. That's covered in about 24 pages of the book. The rest of it is very well done, but you may be bored by, Parsons' life other than that, because it's not very eventful in my opinion. But Parsons, John Whiteside Parsons, was the head of the OTO, the Ordo Templi Orientalis, I believe it is, which is the Thelemic magic group that Crowley joined, or started actually.
Yeah.
No. Crowley sort of took over the OTO, which pre-existed him, and infused it with his own thelemic principles. So it's a long, tangled history to tell how the OTO started in Germany and in Europe. So we won't go into that. People will have to do their own research on that, or we'll save it for another lecture. But the point is that this OTO, this religious group, was in Pasadena with Parsons at the head of it. And just in passing, we'll just say Parsons was also probably one of the people most instrumental in developing jellied rocket fuel, the kind that allowed the Apollo to launch.
Yeah, so, he's one of the original co-founders of the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in California.
Caltech.
So, yeah.
And Caltech had a lot of the players in the Los Alamos game. Yes. They walked that campus.
Now, and there's also an interesting love triangle with this Betty person between Parsons, Hubbard, and Eddie.
Hubbard came to stay with Parsons at the so-called parsonage, which is Parsons' house, where he let all these bohemian types and many OTO members. They would have the rituals upstairs, but not everyone that stayed there was into it. He just wanted any kind of eccentric person to stay there. Well, Hubbard came wearing his full, naval regalia, talking about all the things that he had done, and a lot of it has been documented to be lies. But nonetheless, he is said to have bedded down every single woman in sight, and finally got around, because many women were staying at the parsonage, and he finally made it to Betty, whose actual name was Sarah Northrup, who was the girlfriend of Parsons himself. Well, Parsons, being a Thelemite, could have no jealousy in sexual matters, and I think Hubbard knew this. So Hubbard just sort of moved in on it and said, well, you can't really betray your own principles, can you? You can't really get mad at me. And so what Hubbard did in this meantime, Parsons is distraught, even though he doesn't want to show it, that he's lost his lover. So what he does is he says, well, Hubbard, you have to do these thelemic rituals with me so that we can get me a woman, a person who can be, sort of my soulmate and the person who I need to have. So they did this ritual called the Babalon working.
Right.
And the weird thing about it is that Parsons, he went aside from the thelemic teachings and said, I'm going to do outright black magic. I'm going to jump ahead in these thelemic levels to the higher teachings that I'm not supposed to even read. And I'm just going to kind of intuitively, work out this higher ritual, and it's going to end up developing, this woman's going to come to my front door, and this redheaded woman did come to the front door, which, it obviously could have just been a coincidence, but it wasn't interpreted that way. So the important thing for a lot of people is that Hubbard incanted all this stuff just off the top of his head, which served as the text for this ritual. And Hubbard even said, let's play Shostakovich or whatever. He even put on the right mood music. A lot of people haven't, I think, really latched on to the fact that I think Hubbard at this time was just like, I want to get Parsons not interested in Betty anymore, because obviously she's with me now. Mm-hmm. So if he thinks we can do this ritual and get another woman for him, then let's let him believe that. And I'll keep doing this ritual with him night after night until a woman does show up. And of course one did. So
another pattern that we see with these groups that have had associations in the past, these people with Crowley, is that we tend to see the upper ranks of this sex cult actually tend to then sort of graduate and then go on to form their own cult. And some people have written that claimed, at least, that that's sort of the higher level graduation of thelema and all that is basically then start your own cult, right? It's kind of do your own religion, do it yourself, choose your own adventure style. Really.
No, it is choose your own adventure. Which way book?
And that's why we see Gerald Gardner and Wicca. That's why we see Hubbard and OTO. There's also the Ekankar cult. Paul Twitchell was associated with Hubbard, as I understand.
I wasn't aware of that connection at all, but yeah, I'd like to.
At least that's what I've heard. But that's what you see is the graduation of kind of a practical application of comparative religion to starting your own cult, which makes sense if you understand the different reading lists of these different groups, and what you're doing is sort of teasing out the patterns of, I guess, these different religious traditions, reinventing your own, and then stylizing it, in the way that you see fit, I guess.
Absolutely. With the belief that you've understood a deeper level of the teachings, which were only partial and incomplete.
Yes.
I think that's how I think a lot of people go overboard with Hubbard saying, "Oh wow, he did Thelemic rituals. Oh my gosh, he's involved in magic." But I think, and he was also Hubbard joined the Rosicrucian, the SRIA. I think
he did. Correct. Right.
When he was in New York. But I think this is just, we don't want to go too far and say, oh well, Hubbard was basically influenced by satanic magic or Thelemic magic. I think ultimately Hubbard was interested, he did have a comparative religion kind of approach. Mm-hmm. He would look at anything that was put in front of him, but he always placed it within his own sort of control unit in his head, which said, this is where this goes. This is what was common with everything else that I...
But now, wait a minute, though, because as I understand, his son and his grandson both claim that it was a black magic kind of thing.
Okay. Nibs Hubbard. One thing that's a problem with Nibs Hubbard and Jamie Hubbard, I guess is his name. I don't know what his last name is. I guess Jamie Wolf. But Nibs Hubbard Wolf and Jamie Wolf. I don't know much about Jamie Wolf. I haven't listened to any of his rants or anything. They might be interesting. But Nibs ultimately joined Scientology, became according to his father, one of the greatest auditors in the world. And an auditor is a person in Scientology who uses the techniques of question and answer and things like that on the Scientologist who wants to become clear. Okay, so he rose up in the ranks as Hubbard's own son. Of course he would have to, right? But then he ultimately squandered a lot of money, and frankly, Hubbard didn't pay his people that well. And it was kind of like when you get in a religious group and it's like, well, I only slept 3 hours last night. How many did you sleep? Well, I slept 2 hours, so I'm more dedicated than you. Well, he pays me $30 a week. Oh, yeah, well, I only get 15, There's that kind of weird, and that worked to Hubbard's advantage because he made millions upon millions off of this. And don't let anyone fool you. Hubbard had opulence and wealth you wouldn't believe. He had multi-million-dollar camera collections. He had toys of every variety. So some people try to act like he's some kind of a miser. Well, in a sense he is, because he wanted the money because of what it symbolized. But he also bought a lot of stuff for himself too, while his followers, even the highest of his followers, were, basically starving at times. So Nibs had a family, and Hubbard wouldn't pay him any money. I mean, he wouldn't give him any money and just would go out of the country, and Nibs would be left there with no job except to be an auditor. Mm-hmm. And I think his wife and his family were kind of nagging on him, as they rightly should. And finally, Nibs quit. And he sent a letter to Hubbard and said, look, I can't support my family. I'm going to lose my family if I continue like this. So Hubbard basically said he's a suppressive person, which means a person who is against Scientology, and Xenu is the suppressive of all suppressives, as Hubbard once said. So it's like you're following the spirit of Antichrist or something if you don't do what I say. So Nibs, after this, after he went through all kinds of hardship and got his life back on track, started saying things like, well, he based everything he could. He performed abortions on my mother every few months. A lot of really fantastic things were said. I'm not saying it didn't happen, but I think you'd have to have some kind of corroborating source, because Nibs retracted everything he said at different times because he was paid off. So it makes you wonder if he spread the stories because he wanted to get paid off, or wanted to show his, his low estimation of his father. He wanted to show his ire toward his father. We wonder, is it fact mixed with fiction? Is there some grain of truth to it? Well, it's not the same. If you look at Nibs, it's not the same as looking at other people, disinterested parties who are just passing through the parsonage in Pasadena saying, oh my gosh, they were chanting and there were sexual rituals going on. Well, they have no reason to lie. They have no vested interest in lying about that stuff, and you can look at all the accounts and line them up. But with Nibs, it's more like he has every reason to exaggerate, and you don't know where the exaggeration begins and the truth ends. So I would just say that's one caveat. But Nibs did say, yes, it's all based on Satanism.
Now, what about, and so we see similarities with, for example, the way that Parsons and Crowley and these different people would have their own particular interpretation of the Book of Revelation that was actually, ironically, very similar to the Plymouth Brethren, immanentized, soon to come into the world end times scenario. That Crowley being a Plymouth Brethren, which is where we actually get dispensationalism in the modern era from, that emphasis on the end times and the end is coming, the beast and the Antichrist and all that. Hubbard seems to have had an interest in this as well.
Oh, absolutely. And I would also say, just as a sidebar, with Crowley, when he spent a lot of time in Russia.
Yeah.
He spent time in Russia under assumed names. He spent time in Russia pretending to be a Russian count. And during one of these stays, and he was obviously in touch with a lot of the Rosicrucian, Freemason, occult-style aristocrats in Russia. Mm-hmm. And during this time, during one of these stays in Moscow, I believe it was, he composed the Gnostic Mass, which is used in Oklahoma City. We have the Gnostic Orthodox Church, I believe, and we definitely have the OTO in Oklahoma City. I have no contact with them, but I know that they're there. And the whole idea that the Gnostic Mass of Crowley, which is used in the Gnostic Church and in the OTO, is an adaptation of the Divine Liturgy of St. John Chrysostom,
right?
The version that's used in Russia. So I think the thing with Crowley is that he believed, look, there may be a higher form of everything, but we take what's out there and what's been sort of spread the furthest to the winds, and then we use it to guide toward this direction. We don't just say everything that's out there, we're going to ignore. We're going to look at what catches the most attention, and we're going to re-spin it toward what we want it to be. I think a lot of that's going on, because when he goes to Russia, he looks at what everyone's doing, which is the Eastern Orthodox liturgy. Mm-hmm. And he says, but it's got this meaning, and he changes it.
Yeah.
It's
standard fare for the cults, right?
Hubbard did that as well. I mean, Hubbard would say things like, look, now this doesn't link up to Christianity per se, but it does link up to popular culture. He would say, women need to be women and men need to be men. He would say, if we say men and women need to be congressmen and senators and president and everything, he said if that's taken to its logical conclusion, then women's attention will be taken away from being mothers. And I'm not saying I agree with this. I mean, maybe to a degree, but not as much as he did. But he seemed to, in other words, kind of subscribe to some kind of generalized WASP kind of morality. Mm-hmm. And he would say sexual deviant, ironically, even though, see, that's why I don't believe when he was in the Thelemic rituals that he had any kind of weird kinkiness or any kind of weirdness with his sexual beliefs, because if you look at what he writes, he says sexual deviance is something that R6 put in people. He said homosexuality and child molestation, he said images of that, sexual love toward children and same sex, that's implanted in R6. So he said that's why people are so obsessed with that stuff today.
Let's shift a little bit towards another theme that we see in so many of the UFO cults and the revelations and messages of the so-called Space Brothers, which tends to be that man is on this wider course of evolution, and he's part of the overall evolution of the universe and the biosphere and nature and so forth. And as I read, this is in 1950, Hubbard apparently published an article called Dianetics, the Evolution of a Science. Yes. So, I think this is important because there is this scientific element to it. Even though, like you said, with the official so-called theology, there is this open potentiality aspect to it. It clearly wants to meld with the this is taking place during the so-called atomic age, right? The Manhattan Project and Cold War, and we're with the rise of advanced technology. So Hubbard clearly wants to also tailor this towards the so-called scientific crowd.
Oh yes, he says, look, evolution is correct. Well, everything that's agreed, and the Darwinian synthesis as it existed in circa 1950, he says, I agree with that. He says the only thing that the problem is, he says, that we are focused way too much on the material, and we don't understand that it's all created by Theta. It's all created by the spiritual realm. So he said basically evolution tells you what happened in the past, but it doesn't tell you why